Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Adam from Vineyard Worship, where we gather, train, document, and inspire so that you can lean into your calling and vocation as a worship leader. And this is what I'm asking for today. Heather and I are doing another Ask Us Anything podcast here in a few weeks, and I'd love to include you, your question, and your voice. So here's what I'm hoping. Could you make a short audio voice memo of your question? Be sure to tell us who you are and where you're from along with your question, and we will include as many good questions in the episode as possible. It'll be a fun way to hear from lots of different folks from around the nation, and who knows, maybe around the world. So get in a quiet place, make a short voice memo, and email it to us at info@vineyardworship.com. Again, info@vineyardworship.com. All right, team, let's go. The Ferment.
Well, my name is Susan O'Brien, and this is my story. I grew up in church. My dad's a pastor, and my extended family lived far away in North Carolina, Virginia. So the church became my family because we were in Georgia. So any holiday, there was a family in the church that would always invite us over to their house, and I felt very loved and welcomed. I mean, it was home and it was safe. And I went to a Christian school, and I thrived in that small environment of being known because I was pretty shy. But if you know the same people for 8 years, you kind of open up a little bit more. So that was really good. At the age of 9, I was baptized. And at the age of 9, I also started taking piano lessons. So those are two decisions that I made at 9 that still affect my life today, because I love Jesus and I want to serve his kingdom. And I teach piano lessons, and I've done that for about 20 years. So it's really cool thinking back, wow, at 9, I made life decisions that if I had not done those things, my life would be totally different. I graduated from the same Christian high school, and then I went to a local college, and that's where I met Mike. We were both music majors, but we didn't start dating until after we graduated. And I also went to a Christian college and got a Bachelor of Theology. So I have a music ed degree and a Bachelor of Theology degree. And Mike and I started dating, and I married into the Vineyard. So the church I grew up in was, I like to say, very warm and like a big hug, right? And the Vineyard was very cool. So I feel like one of the disciples or the master of the house when Jesus said, you'll bring out both old and new things and new treasures. And that's what it felt like. I just felt like I learned a lot of new things in the Vineyard. So for example, Mike and I struggled with infertility for 7 years. And in the middle of that, the Vineyard women had a national conference outside of Chicago at this really cool resort. And one of the words at the end of the session was, if you want babies, come forward. And I did. So I came forward, and it changed the trajectory of my life. The person that prayed for me, it was Christy Wimber. She looked at me and she said, this is hard for you because you want to homeschool, and what's the number 3? And I mean, she just listed all these things that no one in that room knew. I mean, I came with people from my church. None of them knew we wanted to homeschool. And at that moment, I just thought, this is real. Like, prophecy is more than just blessed thoughts or inspired encouragement, but it is like real, and I wanted it. Like, I wanted to do the same thing that she had done for me. I wanted to give to other people, you know? And I just cried. I felt the Lord's presence. Eleanor Mumford was one of the main speakers, and I really loved her, and I looked up and she was praying for me. And in that moment, God was really speaking to me in so many ways. And one of those ways is I always feel unseen. Like if I'm in a group of people or a conference, I just feel like I fade into the background. But for someone that was the main speaker to be like, to see me and to pray for me, I just felt a great healing in that. And it still took 5 years for us to have our son Ezekiel, but something was birthed in me in that. It was like April 20th, 2006. It was such a significant day. So I came back and I just did life at church, right? Did different things, kids community, worship band, kids worship, you name it. And then through a series of events, Mike and I just kind of got catapulted into the greater church. And part of that has been just a real gift of getting to know people and being able to travel and serve in the greater church. And that's kind of where I am today. And I do preach once a month at my church, and I homeschool our son. And yeah, that's kind of a quick version of my story.
You're listening to the Ferment podcast, conversations about worship and transformation. Today's guest is Susan O'Brien. Susan is a spiritual director based in Atlanta, Georgia.
Let's just jump in right here because, Susan, when I think about you, I've known you and Mike for a long time. And when I think about you, I definitely think of piano teacher.
Yeah.
I think of musician Susan. I
Right.
think of BGV Susan with Mike.
Yeah.
But I also think of preacher Susan, which I know maybe isn't something you always did. I don't know. You can fill me in here. But I know in the last several years, you've been speaking more. And I know that I see even on Mike's Instagram, you're often on there and you're speaking, you're preaching in front of a room, whether it's your home church or some other place where you guys have traveled. So I'd love for you to just talk to me about that. Talk to me about being a preacher lady.
Well, I didn't even think it was an option, Adam, until a few years ago. It never entered my head. I liked teaching, but through another series of events. So I was listening to a sermon by Simon Ponsonby from St. Aldate's in the UK, and it was about Romans 16. And he just went through, and I always read Romans 16 really fast. It was like, say hello to this person, hello
That's
to
right.
this person, tell that person. I'm like, okay. But he just unpacked it, and there were three women in there. There was Phoebe, who delivered the letter. There was Priscilla from Priscilla and Aquila, and there's Junia, outstanding among the apostles. And so just unpacking what some of that meant. And I was really floored by this is an option, like women being leaders or women preaching, and it's a scriptural option. So, I'd heard a lot of sociological reasons women could preach, and I understand those things, but, if you are preaching and have a scripture-soaked imagination, it's like, no, I need God to speak to me through the scriptures, especially if I'm going to preach the scriptures. I don't need just studies about the way the world works, from people, although that's important. And so I listened to that sermon. That night, I was putting our son, Zeke, to bed, and I started crying. And I had this memory of when I was a teenager saying, oh, if I were a boy, I'd be a preacher. I'd be a pastor, no brainer, right? And I had forgotten that. Now, I had also wanted to be like Mary Lee Retton, a gymnast, and I wanted to be a country music singer, but I could say those things and laugh, where when I said I would have been a preacher if I was a boy, I started crying. So this is happening. Well, soon after is Montreat. So Montreat, the Vineyard Worship Leaders retreat in Montreat, North Carolina. And as you know, when you go to dinner, it's buffet, but you just sit at a common table with people. So I was just sitting with people that I hadn't really met. And somehow the subject of women in ministry came up. I don't even remember the specifics, but the gist was that it was totally normal. So I remember J.T. Meyer being there, and just the way he talked about women in ministry, I had never heard that before. Like Mike, my husband, Mike, was always like, you can do this. It's no big deal. But when I sat at a table like that, that wasn't the conversation. The conversation a lot of times was why women should not do it, and so it was baffling to me, I was just stunned by this. And then we had our session that night, and Liz Wood started singing that song, Lord, You Are My Shepherd.
Yeah.
right? And at the chorus, lead on through the darkest of the night. And I started feeling that feeling of, I'm going to lose it, so I went to the back of the room and I just wept. And I just had this sense of God, like, God, if you want me to do this, I will do it. Even if I feel like people won't understand or they'll think like maybe ill of me, like maybe that I'm like this person trying to make a point, which I'm usually not that person, right? I like that,
Clearly.
that there's nothing about that attracts me, like
Yeah.
being like trailblazer. I'm like, no, please just let me stay in the shadows. And I remember Julie Morgan prayed for me. I mean, it was just all these people in the community that came and they prayed. And it was soon after that we just had opportunities to travel and people would ask us to preach. And we usually co-preached, Mike and I. And then Mike said, I think Susan can just do this by herself. Like, I'll lead worship and she can preach. And so everyone said yes to that. Like all the people that we went to, the churches, the pastors said, yes, we would love that. And I'm still floored by that, right? I'm still like, I can't believe it. Yeah.
I love that. Well, part of what I hear in your story, both the one you just told and the one that you opened up the podcast with, is the amount of community that surrounds you when God is moving and working in your life.
Yes.
This is a little tiny theme that I'm hearing, even just as you've told a couple stories. You wanted to have a baby. You wanted to be homeschooler mom. And Christy Wimber is prophesying to you. She's praying for you. Eleanor Mumford is there. But then also the Lord is doing this other work in you just a short time after that, another kind of birthing, if you will. And Simon Ponsby's sermon on Romans 16 and J.T. Meyer's table and all of these things are people that we know and have come into contact with and that sort of thing. And I'm just hearing the way in which God has used community to sort of like make a place for you. And I don't think that's uncommon either, right? Like this is the way the church is supposed to work.
Yeah. And what's so amazing is it's people that are not my closest friends. It's people that I've just met or people that, like, if I saw Christy Wimber or Eleanor Mumford, they wouldn't know me. Like, I don't think I could say, remember 16 years ago when you prayed for me? Maybe, but just the way that God uses people and the connections, even when you don't think, well, this is my best friend and we do life together, it's just like God brings these people in.
Well,
yeah. And
while you were just saying that, I can't help but think of the scripture. I think it's Acts chapter 13 where the church sets aside Paul for his missionary work.
mm-hmm.
But it's that idea. It's like he's a part of the church, but then at a certain moment, the Holy Spirit begins to single Paul out for this sending work. But it's the Spirit mediated through people.
Yes.
And I hear that in your story as well, in a very similar kind of way.
Yeah, I never thought about that. It's interesting because I always like to think, oh yeah, me and God, like God speaks to me, but God could have spoken that to me and I would not have believed it was God. Like I needed people who loved God to be like, and for it to be almost like not even Susan, this is you. It was just like I was doing my life, like I was eating or I was at a conference and God met me through people. That's
amazing. Well, let's dig in on preaching again here just for a moment.
Okay.
Because I know there's so many ladies and so many girls who are listening to this, and I know that just by telling your story, digging in here a little bit, what we're really doing is giving people permission. So just talk to me about not only hearing the sermon from Romans 16 and not only going on the road with Mike, co-preaching for a while, but then preaching on your own. But just talk to me about, okay, now here you are several years into it. You preach at your own home church once a month. When you go on the road, you preach. What does that feel like to you now? Because as a girl, you were like, "Oh, if I was a boy, I would definitely be a preacher." But now you're in it and it's real. So you didn't have to sacrifice a calling because of your gender. And now you have a few reps under your belt. I'd be just very interested to hear you talk about how does that feel now, and what does preaching mean to you vocationally?
It feels amazing still. Like it's still kind of new in the sense of I can't believe I get to do this. And the amazing thing about preaching once a month or traveling and preaching is that I feel like I get the best of preaching, right? So like I get a month to prepare a sermon. I kind of get to choose my passage of scripture. I get to be the person that comes in um, from out of town, like there's just the expectation
That's
from people.
right.
So it still feels novel and amazing. And I still sometimes struggle with it though. I still sometimes think, um, I just get intimidated, I think. And I sometimes think, is this okay? I think, sure, it's okay. I do a lot less of second guessing now than I did. And I feel like I'm a little bit more confident. But I think one thing, like when you were talking about women or anyone really, I think there's a freedom to be who God made you to be. So I am not naturally a bulldog. I'm not, I don't have like a low voice. Have you ever read that study about how there's more authority with men or even women that have lower timbre voices? I'm like, that is not me. I have like this high voice. And so I don't feel like there's this pressure on me to be who I'm not, which
Yeah.
is surprising. And I think that that's probably one of the things I would love to tell people. Just there's freedom to be the way God made you. If you're quiet, God will use you like that, right? If you're loud, God will use you like that. If you are a pioneer, yes, do those pioneer things. Or if you're more of a background person, just there's freedom in being who God made you to be. And sometimes I feel like, especially in a celebrity culture, we look at people and we think, oh, I have to be this charismatic, outgoing person in order for God to use me. And that just hasn't been the case. And I'm also indebted to people because they've made a place for me. Like I don't feel like I've ever had to fight for a place. And I know not everybody can say that. And so I feel very thankful and appreciative of it being like, yes, Susan, you can be at this table and you can be quiet and you can listen to people. You don't have to be something that you are not or act a certain way in order for you to have permission, to speak into our lives.
That's really beautiful. And the thing I love that you just shared a moment ago was that little note that you were bringing out about celebrity culture. And I
Mm.
wish that this wasn't true in the church, but it just feels like a plague to me right now. I mean, maybe it's because of the fact that I'm 42, or maybe it's because I help lead vineyard worship and I'm just sort of in the worship world in a different place. But you just see the ways in which I'm going to use the word air quotes here, influence culture or celebrity culture has just pervaded everything. And I think you're right. I think it does subtly tell people that in order to have a ministry, air quotes again, or to be effective, that you need to be like someone who's famous, or you need to be an influencer, or you need to have a very hip Instagram, and you need to be on Twitter saying very provocative things. And I just want to echo and resonate with you again, what you just said. You don't have to be, right? Like, I kind of think that stuff is a plague in the church. I don't think it helps.
Yeah, it's terribly oppressive. I think it's almost this like uh, oppressive spirit almost, because even if you're the person that is the celebrity or you're the person that's in, I mean, you have to stay in. Like, you have to make sure no one else gets your spot. And you have to make sure you don't get old, or
That's
overweight,
true.
or you have to be cool. You have to be skinny. You have to look this certain way, or you lose everything. And that is just a lot of pressure for everyone trying to be that, or who is that for a moment.
Yeah. And it has also occurred to me too, and this is maybe a backwards way of saying just exactly what you said. It's occurred to me as well, and I think it's the Lord. I'll just put it that way. Maybe it's God. I don't know. But I have felt challenged by the Lord in the last few years, especially, to make sure that my ears are open to the people that God is putting around me, and that I'm not just listening, or that I'm not just giving the soft part of my heart that's agreeable and teachable to people who are, to use your terms there, celebrity driven, super fit, white teeth, really with it people, because there is something about the package that makes me more susceptible to the message, right? But maybe what God is bringing to me is the person who sits on the back row of my church and who's maybe fairly quiet, but, just lives a normal life, but maybe they have the words of Jesus for me. And I know that in the last few years, that's been a real true theme. Like, the major words from God haven't come from celebrities. It's come from really unassuming people.
Yeah, that's so good. And I know the last scripture that I was preaching on was about the kingdom of heaven, and how the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, or the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, and it's small, right? And it's insignificant, and it's hidden. And I just love that idea of, even as a treasure, like, it's hidden in a field. And as I've traveled, I've noticed that you're right. It's the unassuming people, or it's the people that, maybe not are known by a whole bunch of people, that have spoken encouragement to me that's been really, really deep.
Mm.
And I've found sometimes that I have this expectation of people that I've heard of, right? That is just, it's unfair to them, because they can't be who I want them to be as a celebrity, right? They can't be Jesus. I mean, they can be Jesus, but you know what I mean by
No,
that. Like,
exactly.
there's the expectation of, you're supposed to have something for me,
What's
'cause
that? It's that old saying, never meet your heroes. It'll just let you down. It's like, don't meet
Yes.
just don't do it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, that's actually pretty good advice. I feel
Yeah.
like.
It's not bad advice. It's not. Well, Susan, I want to change directions here, because I know you're also a spiritual director. And I have maybe several questions here about that. But I just want you to tell me the story of, because that's another change in your life. You weren't always a spiritual director. And if I remember your story well at all, I also know that this is not something that's really in your church tradition, right?
Right.
So will you just talk to me about spiritual direction, your encounter with it, and then how you became one?
Okay. So it was actually on my way to Campbellsville that I was reading this book called Sacred Rhythms by Ruth Haley Barton. And it was the first time I'd actually heard of a spiritual director. And when she explained what it was, I thought, I want one of these. I want a spiritual director, and I think I might want to be a spiritual director. And I have to digress a little bit, because you guys are such great hosts at Campbellsville.
Mm.
So I think this was like 2008. And this was the time that y'all had made this amazing breakfast for us. And I think the iPhone was brand new. So one of our band members had one. Like, that's how we got lost coming to Campbellsville, got us there. Anyway, we were all at breakfast and he wasn't there. And then he came in like an hour later, and he was like, what's going on? I thought it was going to be early. And we're like, no, breakfast was at 8.
That's right.
And he's like, well, it is 8. And he looked at his phone and he realized he was in the room that was the Central Time
That's
room.
right. Okay, so
spent the night.
Okay, so here's some insider knowledge, and then I'll let Susan tell her story. Some insider knowledge for people who come to stay with me. If you come to my house, you need to turn auto update on your phone off, because my house is on the line. And so your phone will just switch back and forth between Eastern and Central. My bedroom is in Eastern, but my kitchen is in Central. And depending on where you're at in the house, it'll just flip back and forth. And if you don't turn it off, you'll never know what time it is. So this story
was amazing.
Listen, Susan, this story has happened, I don't know, 30 times with people. Yeah. Love it. Love it. Love it.
Yes. Yeah. So we are one of the 30.
Yes.
Right. So anyway, I remember being in the whatever van we had rented with all our equipment and reading this book and like reading quotes out loud to our friends, like the soul is like a wild animal. You have to be quiet for it to come in. A Parker Palmer quote, you can't just go stomping in and expect to observe your soul. So that was like 2008. And that was a little bit before spiritual direction was pretty well known. Like it took a while to kind of figure out how would I get trained or whatever. So I had pursued it, and then things would fall through. Like there wouldn't be enough people for a certain cohort for a certain time, or I just kept putting it on the back burner. Like now's not a good time to do it. But when we kind of got catapulted into the greater church, I realized now's the time. And so I got certified. And one thing that I remember our teacher, Chris Miller, talked about was that like spiritual direction and contemplation is the slow work of God, and where the charismatic, like the prayer ministry, those moments is the fast work of God. And something in me just clicked with that. And I thought, yes, like this makes sense. It's the work of God. It's just the speed of it. Right. So it seemed like such a kingdom of God thing, as well as this ancient practice of just listening to people and noticing the work of God. And so I got certified in spiritual direction, and I have spiritual directees, and it's one of those life-giving aspects of my life that I just love. And going back to what I said about just being who you are, I was always the listener at the table. I was never like the one telling all the stories. The amazing thing about being on a podcast is that I have no competition, right? You're asking me so I can tell my stories. But
Yes.
if I'm at a group of people, unless I really know them well, I'm not going to be telling my stories. I'm going to be listening, and I'm comfortable listening. I like that, So this is a really cool vocation because I get to listen to people's stories and I get to see God move. Just like when people were praying for me and I experienced God moving in my life, I feel like I can see that on other people, whether I'm praying for them at the end of ministry time or whether I'm doing spiritual direction. It's the same kind of feeling and privilege just to say, it feels like God's doing that. And you do that in your podcast. You do some spiritual direction, Adam. I think you probably know that, right?
Well,
Like I noticed this theme.
Okay, so here's the thing. Susan, this is not what I'm good at.
What? You're kidding.
No, I mean temperamentally speaking, I'm more of a talker rather than a listener.
Uh-huh.
And I've had to learn. I've had to learn, and I've only learned by having some people listen to me, and then also to reflect the hard truth of, hey, you kind of talk a lot, and you're pretty sure you're right.
But that's important. I feel like that's important. But I know what you're saying.
You know what I mean? So yeah. So no, that is one of the little threads that I've picked up in the spiritual direction that I've had in my life. Is my spiritual director saying to me, hey, one of the things I've been hearing you say today or over the last 3 months, something that keeps coming up, you keep using this phrase. And then we just go there. And it's like, oh, yeah, this is actually the slow work of God in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned listening. That was one of the first things we learned is how to listen and how to like eye contact. And how easily we're distracted, especially with phones and noises and things. And so we just practiced listening. And it was like an active listening. Like it is hard work to stay focused on what the person's saying, right? And not just think, oh, that reminds me of the time of this, but to really hone in. Listening is a great skill. And then the bad news is you notice it when you're out in culture, like that person is not listening to me. Like they are not interested in anything I'm saying.
That's true.
Okay.
But I just want to say one more thing about listening here.
Yeah.
You were saying it takes your energy. There's something as a listener you have to give. You have to bring to it, right? Mm-hmm. I've also noticed that if I'm really working at listening, part of what makes me uncomfortable is the intimacy of really listening. Because like you just said, you need to look in the other person's eyes. You need to give them your attention and not just let your brain wander to formulating the next thing you want to say, but just listen. And there's some intimacy there. And by intimacy, I just mean deep human connection that it feels like our modern culture, it doesn't teach us that. It actually trains us to do the opposite. And so I know for me, one of the things that I've learned over the last 4 or 5 years is as I've tried to be a better listener, is that sometimes I feel very uncomfortable, and it's just because it's not even that I'm uncomfortable with what this person is sharing. It's just that, oh my goodness, we're having a very human experience. And even though they're the one sharing, I feel exposed. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's taken me a while to get over it.
By Margaret Gunther about holy listening is the name of the book. It's amazing. Whether you're a spiritual director or not, I would highly recommend it. And she just gives these metaphors for spiritual direction. And one is like a place of hospitality. So like when you listen on this podcast, you are holding space for people, and you are making like the space between us hospitable, which is a lot of work, or a midwife, which that one I really like, because God is birthing something in someone else. But the midwife works in these intimate places and says, this is what I see. Like, you're in transition, breathe, like you're normal. Everything's fine. What you're feeling is this, just naming what they see. And it's this amazing role, because you're not the one working in that person's life. Like when you hear people's stories, it's not you doing it, but you are observing it and you're calling it out. And it is like a midwife. It's this connection in this intimate place of God birthing something, and you get to watch it. And that's part of you listening to people's stories here. Like lots of things happen on the podcast of people's like birthing things, right? Or even just putting some streams together that don't make sense, or even as it goes out and other people listen to it. It is a very sacred place.
Yeah. I love that image of a midwife, because you're right. The midwife doesn't do the work. They're not making it happen in the other person. They're not even the other person who's experiencing the work. Mm-mm. It's just naming. And the comfort of having someone along the journey.
Yes. And watching someone suffer can be kind of hard. Like watching someone struggle with what God's doing can feel like, oh, I wish I could just come in and make this better, or I wish I could just not engage, because this isn't my story. This isn't my pain, but here I am with you, right? I'm just with you in it. And I think that's probably part of what you're talking about with listening too, is that you are with the person, whether they are in joy or in pain. And it costs you something, to be there, to be present.
Hey, I want to go back to something you said a moment ago when you were talking about spiritual direction and even your own journey. You contrasted the slow work of God with the fast work of God. So spiritual direction or listening or taking a contemplative journey, that's the slow work of God. And then you sort of contrasted that with the fast work of God, which might be, charismatic prayer ministry or prophecy, those sorts of things. Just talk more about that, because I think here in the Vineyard, we're experiencing an awakening to the contemplative, but there may be people who are on the podcast who haven't had that much experience with it, or maybe they're from more traditional Pentecostal or charismatic backgrounds, and they're really unfamiliar with the slow work of God. Just talk to me about the slow work of God and the fast work of God, or how the contemplative marries our own kingdom theology. I think this is really important.
Yeah, it really does marry that kingdom theology of God is working in every person's life, whether it's slow or fast. And so I kind of think of it like going on a trip to the beach. So we live in Georgia, and if we go to Florida, the trip to the beach looks like this. It looks like a highway for most of the time. We're going 70 miles an hour. And then there comes a point where the highway can't get to the beach. The highway, you just can't do that. You have to go on an off-road, and you have to go through little towns of like 25 miles an hour, right? And you're only like 30 miles from the beach, but it's going to take you an hour because there's stop signs and things like that. And so, like, as I've journeyed to places, I've felt that from God, just that sense of like, there are some places that you can't get to on a highway. You have to go slow. You have to do like the patient, the perseverance, like that work, or you'll never see the scenery. You will never see the beach if you just stay on the highways. And so I think the same thing can be said of us on our spiritual journey. Like, we need the highways. Yes, because those are amazing moments where God moves quickly. And I love those moments, right? I have those moments that have been almost like just these trajectory changing moments. And so I say, yes, let's pursue those, right? If we have a conference, if we have a church service, let's go for those moments of God moving quickly, because why not, right? But on the day-to-day life, like, most of my life is spent in the mundane, like homeschooling or making lunch, or, just driving, getting gas, or, like, that's where most of my life is spent. It's not on a podcast talking to you, like, this feels exciting to me. It's that slow pace. And so if God only meets us in the fast places, then we have to have a very fast life in order to meet God. And we have to expect him to move all the time, automatically, and do miracles. And I mean, like, we would be addicted to those things when God is present all the time. And so it's just a question of, are you aware of it? Are you aware that God is with you right now, and he's with you, and he can speak to you in the most mundane of places? And that's really where the discipline is built. So I do teach piano lessons, and I did a Zoom recital for the first time because we're all doing online lessons in these days. And I have these two siblings that take lessons, and they practice 20 minutes every day. And they have for the few years they've played. Like, I always tell people, the first lesson, like, practice 20 minutes a day. Well, the mom took a hold of that nugget, and she asked her kids to do it, and they do it unless they're on vacation. So we're doing this Zoom recital, and all my students do a great job, but they are young, and they're playing these really complicated songs. And so a lot of the comments that I got from my other students were, wow, they were really good. Like, they were amazing. And so that was a moment where they got to show off. And it was an exciting moment. Like, I feel like that's like the fast work of God. Like, that's it's like the pow, wow, that's amazing. But they were willing to do the work of every day, 20 minutes a day. And that's why they had that moment, And so I think of that in our spiritual lives. I think about, what are we doing every day? What are those mundane practices that really are going to be the foundation of when we do get a chance to be like a fast moment, or we do get to be in front of people, or we do get to experience a pandemic, or, those are the things that are really what build your life on the foundation, is that slow work. It's that mundane, ordinary, boring life. But it makes it less boring if you think God can meet me right now. Like when I'm eating my toast, God could tell me something, or God could show me something.
That's right.
It makes it more exciting.
Yeah, you know what? I think you just dropped two images in that last little section that, man, it's worth the price of the podcast. If you've been listening,
Okay.
I don't know, we may not say anything better than what Susan just said there. I love that image of the highway to the beach, but eventually, gosh, especially if you've driven to the panhandle of Florida, you don't get to stay on the highway. You have to get off, and you're going to drive through those little towns for over an hour, and the kids are just going nuts, But it's the only way to certain places. I love, that's a really brilliant thought. There's only a certain road you can take to get to certain places. That's great. Well, let me ask you another question, Susan, because we're talking about contemplative practices, and they appeal to certain people. This is something I've noticed. They appeal to certain people. There are certain personality types, certain Enneagram types, certain historical types of people who really resonate, and just as soon as they hear about spiritual direction, they're like, oh, this is me. And then there are other people, we'll call them kinetic types. We'll call them people who are very much maybe in their body, people who have adult ADHD, who maybe hear you and go, that's really cool, and I've tried it, but it was just so slow, or maybe it was boring. I don't know how to manage that. I don't know what to do. You're a spiritual director. Tell us.
Yeah.
Tell us what to do.
That's great. Well, I read this book by Pete Greig, and one of the things he says, he was the founder of the 24/7 prayer movement. He said, you have to pray the way God made you.
Mm.
And, I've read conflicting things. I've read some people that said, you will have a go-to spiritual discipline that's yours, but you also need to stretch out and do something that's different than your personality. So I think both are true, but I think you're going to live in the place where God made you. And so I think we naturally think silence and solitude for contemplation. And I think, yes, that's true. But I also think there are ways of developing a contemplative life that aren't even necessarily a quiet version. Okay. So like the kinesthetic learner, to me, it seems cruel to tell someone who learns by movement to say, sit down and read, right? Because not everybody meets God in reading. For some people, reading is torture, right? And so I get really sad when I meet people who love Jesus, but they just think, I can't do that reading and journaling thing that you do. That sounds like a disaster to me. I might say, I can't just run and speak to God, run a marathon. That sounds horrible. So I think there's freedom to choose and to try a lot of different spiritual disciplines. There's books about Spiritual Disciplines Handbook, I think by Adele Calhoun, which has tons of spiritual disciplines, but a lot of them are community, they're the Eucharist, their discernment. There's just tons of things. And so I would say, keep trying different things, right? And do things that are uncomfortable. It is important for me to do things that are not just sitting and thinking, because I can get stuck in rumination there. And it's not prayer, it's rumination. And it's not helpful. And a lot of my journals are rumination journals. I'm like, I am praying, but no, I'm not. I'm just going over the same problem without a solution. That's not a spiritual discipline, but I feel like because I journaled, it is. So I would say there's freedom, and try a lot of different things. And where you meet God is where he meets you. So go to those places. If there are sacred places that you think, gosh, every time I go to the art museum, God meets me. Well, then go to the art museum when it's open, right? Or every time I take a hike in this one place, God says something. Well, please go do that. Like that, to me, is a contemplative life, is a life where you're doing the things where God meets you, but you're also holding them lightly, because in different seasons, as you know, the way you met with God when you were 20 or in high school when you were single, and the way you meet God when your kids are up all hours of the night, and the way you meet with God when you have an empty nest. I mean, there's just seasons of life, just like there's seasons in the world. And you don't wear a coat in the summer. So I would say if you're uncomfortable and you're trying spiritual practices that aren't working, then try something that fits, because maybe you're in a summer season and people keep giving you coats saying this is how you need to go out in the world. You need to wear a coat. But that's true only if it's winter for you, right? It's not true if it's summer. So I do think silence is super important in our world of noise. And I think solitude is super important. And it can be hard to do, especially in this time when a lot of people are just stuck at home. Like, where do you go for solitude? But you don't have to do those things sitting. You can do those things working and moving and, at the gym or wherever you can.
I love something you said a moment ago. You said, go find God in the places God finds you. You said something like that.
Yeah.
Something like, you had some version of that, which it just occurred to me when you said that if you're able to do that, there's a sense in which you're becoming aware of the ways in which God is working in your life. And that's kind of the point of spiritual disciplines. That's kind of the point of spiritual formation, is to be aware of where God is interacting with you. And so if it is on a walk, well, then great. You've already done the main thing, which is being awake to God while you're walking. So let's go walk more.
Yes. And to not, there's that story of David and Goliath when Saul put his armor on David. He's like, okay, if I can't convince you not to fight Goliath, at least take this armor that I have. And David was like, I can't move around in this. Like, I have to use what I know, like where I've met with God. And so I think there's like a grit to fight for that, and to say, like, even when people listening to me now, they might say, no, Susan, I don't meet God like that. I meet God like this, right? But to just know beyond knowing that you know where God meets you, and you can try new things, but it's not, you don't have to give your power to someone else to say, this is how God works in your life. Spiritual directors or preachers or spiritual friendships are there just to notice how God's already working. They're not there to say, this is how you need to do it, because I find people, and I think it's sad. I think when people, they love Jesus, but they just don't think they're good at praying or the disciplines. And so there's this sense of shame. But I just think, no, God meets you. It's just an awareness of, those are just vehicles, right? Yeah. Of just placing yourself somewhere where God can meet you.
Well, and that's why we need spiritual friendships, or that's why we might need a spiritual director, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't you just talk about that? Why might we need someone to walk with us in our journey?
Yeah, well, I think what you said earlier about how your spiritual director was able to say, hey, I noticed this. You keep saying this. Let's explore that, right? And even though you were the one saying it, you probably weren't aware of how much you were saying it. You needed someone to reflect back to you. And God has made us to be interdependent. And I think one thing that's hard in this culture is to be interdependent. And I've noticed it a lot in this season of shelter in place or quarantine, of how much I've missed the voices of other people. So God made us to be interdependent. We need each other. And me as a quiet introvert, Enneagram 9, like, I need other Enneagram numbers around me. I need people that talk. I need people that are active. I need people that will say, Susan, let's go for a walk. I need people to get me out of my head, because I will just stay there and I'll say, no, this is how God, the flip side of saying, God, this is how God meets you is that I use that as an excuse. And I'm like, no, this is how God meets me. This is it, where other people can expand that and say, maybe he'll meet you as you're traveling, maybe he'll meet you here. And so it is so nice to have a spiritual friend or a spiritual director that their whole emphasis for that time that you meet together is to pay attention and to pay attention to God and to pay attention to you. And just selfishly, I like having a spiritual director that doesn't know anybody that I really know or that's in my world. So I can say, this is what's happening with this person. And they have no preconceived notion about that person. I can be honest. And they can just say what they're seeing. Well, I see that you're going in desolation here. I have a lot of that one. Like I awfulize everything. My spiritual director will say, you're awfulizing everything, so just that I need someone to see that in me and to say, hey, stop, stop. Don't go down that road. It's not going to do anything. You're just going to ruminate and say how awful everything is. Where naturally on my own, I would think, well, I'm just praying and pouring out my complaint to God.
Yeah, that's so insightful. While you were just talking there, Susan, I had this mental picture of a person who lived their life without any mirrors, right?
Oh, okay. Tell me more about that.
Well, I was just thinking, if we don't have a spiritual friend, if we don't have a spiritual director, it would be kind of like living in a mirrorless life. You could live, but you wouldn't know that your hair was crazy and that you needed to brush your teeth, or maybe that your face needed washed, or you know what I'm saying? Just you wouldn't be able to take care of yourself as well.
That's good. That's a really good point.
There's a sense in which you would just be very, very clueless about some things about your life that might be fundamental to how you present. Not that everything is presentation, and not that we're becoming more performative, but there is a sense in which, wow, I am presenting in this world a certain way, and I need someone who cares about my soul, who cares about my own formation, to help me by reflecting who I am, what they're hearing, what they're seeing. Oh, I just, I hang out with you once a month for an hour, and hey, this just comes up all the time, And it's not just bad things either. It could be like some really good things,
Yes.
that I don't feel confident in, or that I don't realize are gifts from God. And so just as you were sharing that, I was just thinking, gosh, without a spiritual friend, it would be like a mirrorless life. And that kind of friendship, or that kind of space that spiritual direction offers, is really helping people present themselves to God, but then also to the community that they live in their best way.
I really like that. You should write that down. I should write that down.
You write it down, okay? You write it down. You put it in your journal.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and just that point of you can't take care of yourself without a mirror.
Yeah.
That's really good to just sit with that. I think is really good.
Okay, so let's talk about one more thing here before we wrap up.
Okay.
Because we were chatting a moment ago, and we were just talking about how contemplative practices really resonate with some people, and then other people are like, I struggle, and maybe even the word boredom comes up, because this is something I've talked to people about. Can you just talk to me about spirituality and boredom? This is something I've been thinking about a little bit too. Talk to me about, especially, I guess I'm thinking about it this way. We're in the Vineyard. We have a history of the Holy Spirit doing fastings. We've been using that kind of language, the slow work of God and the fast work of God. So we're in a movement that prizes the fast work of God. What happens when you have a history, or you have an experience of the fast work of God, and then, to maybe use your language again here, all of a sudden you find that the seasons have changed, and God's primary work in your life is not fast, but it's actually very slow. And maybe your entire life has been summer, and now you find yourself in winter. Just talk to me about that just for a minute.
Yeah, that's good. So one of the good things about homeschooling is that I'll read a lot of just articles about learning or the brain. And there's this article about the importance of boredom. And so, like, your kids need to be bored because what happens in that boredom, things kind of get settled, but creativity is birthed in boredom. So, like, if you give a kid uh, a cardboard box, well, if they have their phone, they're not doing anything with that cardboard box. They're playing with their phone, right? My son is playing with his phone right now. So I'm not saying this is like, we only have cardboard boxes, right? Um, but if they just have a cardboard box and tons of hours, they will start to be creative about what they can do with that box. And so I think there's a sense of God allows boredom because we are co-creators with God. And so he wants you to be creative. And he wants you to try some new things or with what you have to see how you can make things less boring. How you
Yeah.
can make those things. And when you were talking about like the history of our vineyard movement, I think there's also another aspect of meeting God where he's unexpected.
Okay, so when you say that, here's what I think of.
Okay.
Let me think here. Luke chapter 4. Yeah, that's right. Luke chapter 4, Jesus shows up and he's like, hey, can I have the scroll? And they give him the scroll and he's like, he reads out of Isaiah. And he says, this scripture is it's the scripture where it says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, he rolls it back up and he says, well, in your hearing today, this scripture has been fulfilled. And it says, everybody's amazed. They're like, whoa. And then it says, then they say to themselves, isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't this Joseph's boy? And then it says the next thing they say is they're offended and they run him out of town. Right? So there's that idea, just kind of what you were hinting at, that the Jesus we knew can keep us from knowing the Jesus who's sitting in front of us now. Like Jesus the carpenter can keep us from knowing Jesus the Messiah, or what God did for me in the past can be a huge hindrance to what God is doing with me now. And, the biggest roadblock to most charismatics that I know is the fast work of God in their history.
Yes.
Because if God begins to do something different, especially if it's slow, and it will happen, mark my words, if you have had God do miracles in your life and do a bunch of fast, dynamic things, there is a slow season coming. And if you don't have an expectation for that, it can be devastating to your soul.
Yes. And I think of Elijah. I finally thought of the story.
There
right?
we go.
So,
come on, think of it.
Elijah knew the fast work of God, right? Fire comes down. It soaks up the altar. That he prayed for rain. He prayed for not rain. He knew those moments. And then when he met God on the rock, on the mountain, right? God came in the whirlwind. Well, no, he didn't. Like, it was a whirlwind, but God wasn't there. And Elijah was used to seeing God in the whirlwind, right? Or there was like a big storm, but God wasn't there. And God came in the quiet voice or the stillness or the silence. And so even in that, I feel like there are those moments, like you said, in every person's life, especially those that are prophetically gifted or those that have experienced the fast work of God. And there's no doubt in their life that God is in those things, that God will sometimes come in the most unexpected ways, like Jesus the carpenter versus Jesus the Messiah. And those can be like those liminal moments. This happened to Elijah when he was depressed and he's like, just kill me now. Like I'm ready to go. Right.
I'm done.
Right. And the angel says, no, just keep sleeping and eat and then meet God here. And God gives him, one of the things God does on that mountain is he gives him a new job, right? He gives him, I want you to anoint this person. I want you to get Elisha to be your mentoree or whatever. So God is not limited by fast or slow or quiet or loud. And I kind of love how God gives space to all people. So there seems like there's seasons that are the extroverts love, right? And God's working in those, and the introverts are slowly dying, right? And then there are moments where God works in the introverts, and the extroverts are bored to tears, but God just seems to be kind and open to speak to people in all sorts of ways. And for us to think and be aware that other people might need something that we don't need. So, especially in terms of, I think sometimes in conferences or things like that, my expectation is that God will meet me in ministry time, because he met me in ministry time before. So when I go to this conference, he's going to meet me in ministry time, and the main speaker is going to pray for me, right? Because that happened to me. But then I go and the main speaker walks right past me, doesn't even say hello, right there. And I'm like, man, what is happening to the vineyard, right? Or what is happening
I love that.
to
Yes.
me?
Yes.
What is happening to these leaders? They're really stuck,
Yes.
But God meets me at before the conference when I go to Chick-fil-A or somewhere for breakfast, and the server, somebody refreshes my beverage and says something incredibly encouraging to me.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, wow. God can meet me wherever I am. And just because he met me that way, he is not going to always meet me in the same place.
No, that's a great word. Really great word. Well, I want to wrap the podcast here with the question we're asking everybody this season. I'd love it if you'd just share with us something you're dreaming about right now. What's the dream of your heart?
So I feel like the dream of my heart is one of those dreams that's probably going to be realized in the world to come, in the new heaven and the new earth, because a lot of my dreams are based on connection. I really wish everyone I loved lived close to me. I really wish that everyone I served with in my 20s still loved Jesus.
Yeah.
I wish I was connected to people and God, and I felt that connection all the time, right? So I was talking about that conference, but just to go into a room and think, this is my family, and I can be bold and connect with people. I don't have to wait for them to connect with me, or just that sense of connection. This is such an Enneagram 9 thing. But that's kind of the hope. I feel like a lot of my hopes, that's the desire beneath the desire. So I want a cure for COVID. I want a cure for COVID because I don't want people to die, but I want to be able to meet with people, right? I want to be able to connect and to touch someone, even on the shoulder. I want people to love Jesus, that have always loved Jesus. I think that's another one too. Just a lot of my story that I haven't talked about is just watching a lot of my friends who love Jesus journey, and I don't know if they love Jesus anymore.
Yeah.
And I know that's normal in the sense of it's not surprising, but it is heartbreaking. Hey, I served with you. We did a lot of stuff together. We did a lot of women's ministry together. And now I don't even know, what you think about God or about his people. So I have a dream of just connections and healing. I also think that would solve a lot of problems with racial injustice, as well, as that if we were able to connect with people that are different than us and to really see, this is God's image, and I'm connected to this person. It's harder to be unkind to people that you're connected to.
Yeah. When you know someone, you have grace for their story.
Yeah, right? Love covers a multitude of sin.
It does. It's
really
just
does.
real. It's just real.
Yeah.
Well, Susan, thanks for sharing your story, and thanks for just sharing all your wisdom with us today.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
you for asking me.
Oh,
this feels like I feel like I've made it. Right?
Oh,
I'm on the
dude.
Ferment podcast.
Oh, my word.
I love it. So
Well,
thank you. I was so excited.
You got to come back, because I just feel like we scratched the surface. Hey, also, before we stop the podcast, tell people, I know that you do spiritual direction work. Just, do you have a website? What do you have?
I do.
Shout out. Give it a shout out.
Okay. It's Rivers of Eden SD for spiritual direction. Yeah. riversofedensd.com.
All right. Listen, if you need a spiritual director, maybe Susan's your person. I don't know.
Maybe I am. You should try it out.
That's right. riversofedensd.com.
That's right.
Perfect. All right, everybody. Hey, thanks, everybody. Glad you were listening. And there's a lot here. You may have to listen to this one twice. Peace.
Hey everyone, Casey Corum here, producer of the podcast. Thanks for listening. As always, if you've been enjoying the podcast, here's a few ways you can help us. First of all, leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Also, connect with us on social media. Instagram at the Ferment Podcast and Twitter at FermentCast. All right, everyone, thanks for listening. See you next week. Peace.